Welcome back everybody to Razzpuytin Gaming Presents. This time I'm bringing you my review after obtaining the Platinum Trophy for Atomic Heart. Atomic Heart is a first-person action-adventure sort of FPS style game that takes place in a dystopian future. This future sees the rise of robots and an interesting look at science fiction in general. To get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after obtaining the Platinum Trophy to set me apart from the other reviewers on the platform. This game comes from publisher Focus Entertainment. The story is likely to run you about 20 hours doing everything that the game has to offer, and it'll probably run you in the ballpark about 40 hours or so, a bit more or less depending on how you play to obtain the Platinum Trophy. Then last but not least, before we move on to the meat of this review, I'm going to be doing my best to avoid spoilers. From there, let's actually dive into this thing. I can say that for me, this game ran quite well for me. The game does seem to lack quite a few things such as New Game Plus mode or just a lot of accessibility options that I like to see in a game like this, such as the ability to adjust the field of view and honestly, just a lot of other things as well that again I'd like to see. Fortunately, a lot of that stuff is just missing, so something to keep in mind. From there, let's move on to the rest of this stuff, starting with the story setup. Again, I'm not really going to be spoiling anything major, but I will be talking about the general setup to the plot, so if you want to go in completely blind, I probably just skip this part. That said, Atomic Heart takes place in 1955 in a sort of alternative dystopian future. In this particular timeline, after the events of World War II, the Soviet Union rapidly increased its science and research outputs to manufacture all sorts of robots as well as other wondrous technologies, even by today's standards. The game opens just a few days after the launch of a brand new technology that is supposed to allow humans to direct robots directly with their minds. However, as the game kicks off, all of the robots suddenly and without warning turn hostile and start killing everyone within Facility 3826, which is a fictional military base where a lot of the stuff was being tested and experimented on. So now our job, playing as top secret agent known as P3, is simply to get to the bottom of this. Now, as far as plot details go, that's pretty much all I'm going to give you. Beyond that, though, general impressions on the story, I thought it was very interesting. It took a few twists and turns that was to be expected, and some stuff that I didn't really see coming. Broadly speaking, I really enjoyed this game quite a bit. I enjoyed the writing of the game, and I especially enjoyed the banter between our player character, P3, and his companion, the Power Glove. I thought the voice actors did a good job of conveying the desired and various attitudes throughout the game, including some snarkiness and some bitterness that was happening. Now, moving on to difficulty. The game touts 3 different difficulties, story to Armageddon. Story is, of course, easy. You take very little damage comparatively speaking, though you can still die. Enemies have less health, but as you go up in difficulties, these things of course increase, including the damage you take. More enemies have more health, which puts a bit of a strain on you and your resources, which I will get into in a little bit. You have to keep a closer eye on your ammunition in Armageddon difficulty, which can make some of the boss fights in particular pretty difficult, but generally speaking, it wasn't too bad, especially if you take the time to sort of scavenge around for materials and that kind of thing. Overall, though, I'd say the difficulty options at least are in pretty good place. That brings us to our progression systems. As we take Agent P3 through this bizarre adventure, we'll have a few different options for progressing our character as well as our weapons. Pretty early on in the story, you'll meet a robot who acts as sort of your upgrade vendor, usually in the same room as a manual save point. But at this vendor, we can choose to upgrade our sort of talent points, if you will, or the weapons themselves. Now, character-wise, we have access to about 94 skills. I believe that's the exact count. All of these skills can vary up your play style a little bit. These are divided into your character skills as well as some abilities you can actually use. Your character skills are generally just utility stuff, things like more health, more inventory space, that kind of stuff. The others typically give you an attack that you can actually use, like flame or cold or shock, the typical kind of RPG kind of attacks. You can only equip 2 of these at a time, but these will let you do things like discharge electricity from your glove, which is enabling you to do all this stuff for something like frost to freeze enemies, just like I mentioned earlier, and just in general apply different elemental effects. However, doing this will cost you energy, which lets you sort of alternate between using it as your melee weapon or using it to power up your abilities. As for melee weapons, they will actually regenerate energy for you, allowing you to keep using your powers a little more often. You can also just sit back and use ranged weapons. They use more traditional ammunition. The twist is that you can even add elemental effects to those, which we'll get into in a moment. As you defeat enemies, you will be picking up all sorts of resources from them with your glove. What you're after in particular are polymers. Polymers will allow you to increase your skills, in particular your talents. Whenever you are at the vendor, you can just refund and reallocate these however you want, so you're not really locked into any particular kind of play style outside of just getting to a vendor and changing it. So you can experiment and find things that work for you, which is kind of cool how this game does that. This makes the game enjoyable as you can try out different skills and styles without having to restart a new game. And that's before we even start talking about weapons. We get access to a variety of weapons across the game, from an axe to an AK-47 to a rocket launcher that's called a Fat Boy, and an obvious nod to Fallout, all of which can mix up your playstyle quite a bit. But first you have to get your hands on them. You get a few of these just through the natural story progression, and a lot of them you'll unlock a blueprint for as you go along. Then, when you are at the upgrade vendor, you can, if you have the resources, craft whichever weapon you have a blueprint for. Additionally, you can upgrade your current weapons. You can, by increasing their damage, you can customize them for reducing recoil, other typical upgrades in RPG style weapons that you can do. Each weapon will come with a sort of variety of base upgrade, but you can unlock optional blueprints by completing the testing ground areas. And the testing ground areas have the best blueprints. Those areas we'll talk about in the world building section. You can get access to other blueprints that will allow you to actually customize specific things about a weapon, like what kind of sight you're using, as well as some more nuanced points of the handling, as I mentioned, recoil reduction, things like that. Probably the most interesting thing you can do here is add cartridge slots to a weapon, which will allow you to slot in elemental cartridges, which will then, of course, add elemental damage to that particular weapon for a period of time. This option helps balance out the use of your elemental effects from your actual glove, as the enemies pretty much across the board have things that they're weak to and resistant against. So having a nice spread of elemental effects here, so you can adjust on the fly accordingly, is pretty helpful. That, I would say, is the main stuff as far as progression goes. But mainly I would say don't neglect crafting. Overall, you can craft all sorts of consumables, ammunition, etc., things like that. And you're going to be picking up a lot of stuff from fallen enemies and the environment itself. And even if you're picking up items you don't plan on using, you can then at the vendor disassemble this stuff and turn it into things you actually may want to use, like say ammunition for the weapon you want to use. So if you're not using the pistol, you can disassemble the pistol ammo and create ammunition for your AK-47 if that's the way you want to go. So even on Armageddon difficulty, you can get to the point where resources are less of an issue provided you're actually scrapping the stuff you're not using, which is pretty much par for the course. All of that said, let's actually talk about combat, which is kind of the showpiece for Atomic Heart. For the most part, it's pretty fast paced. You'll see a lot of robotic enemies sort of jumping and moving around very quickly, and there are even a few slower ones. And if that wasn't enough, we can even fight some mutated humans, utilizing all the options we've mentioned up to this point, the various weapon types, the elemental effects, all while we sort of balance between using our energy, our glove powers, our weapons themselves, the ammo, and getting a good mix in. There's usually a best way to go, but one thing I will say is that the game gives you a lot of weapons up front. And with the sort of upgrade system, you'll probably put a lot of upgrades on those first few weapons. You'll probably have a very good time if you actually make an effort to sort of diversify what you're doing with all your weapons and even use some of the energy weapons. Potentially you can get your hand on a few guns that instead of shooting ammo actually use your glove energy, which is something to note if you need a ranged weapon and you're out of regular ammunition, which can happen on the Armageddon difficulty. But towards the beginning of the game, when your resources are scarce, you only have a couple of weapons that make it a little difficult to upgrade. And in that particularly early stage of the game, it can feel more like a survival horror experience, almost where you're kind of trying to conserve resources a bit. But by the time you hit the more open world portion of the game, this becomes a bit less of an issue as far as resources are concerned. Mixing up your playstyle and having some fun is a much easier thing to do. There are still a few things I want to mention here, and that is for starters, the skill trees seem to be a bit weighted towards the actual character skill trees. I found a lot of the upgrades in sort of the base skill tree to be really good, such as mass telekinesis, increasing your damage resistance, pumping up your health, increasing your inventory space, allowing you to heal somewhat automatically, and healing with one hand, which allows you to heal and shoot instead of effectively being defenseless while you're trying to heal for a few seconds at a time. So I didn't find myself using a ton of the elemental skills they give you access to until quite a bit later into the game when I had more skill points to go around, or polymer, if you will. But as far as the skills go, you can only have 2 of them equipped at a time, which leaves you with relatively few options as to what you're going to use at any given time. And you can only switch those out at the weapon upgrade station, which is why the cartridge slots on your weapons come in handy, and adding elemental effects to them as well becomes important. But how much you enjoy combat is probably going to come down to how much you enjoy juggling all those sorts of things at once. Although on normal difficulty and the easy difficulty, this isn't even really necessary. On Armageddon difficulty, it's much more of a thing that you'll need to alternate between powers and weapons and elementals. On normal difficulty, honestly, you can just get by upgrading your base shotgun because it does a tremendous amount of damage. And if you put some cartridges on there, you can effectively find the weak points of any of the enemies you're coming across. And as long as you keep your ammo filled, you'll probably be good to go, especially if you upgrade a backup melee weapon. Like I said, the combat is very fast paced, and I'm sure you've seen on the screen, there's a lot of movement involved. There's quite a bit of weight to your attacks when you hit things, and it's certainly an enjoyable experience. I personally had a lot of fun towards the later part of the game where I could experiment and mess around with all sorts of weapons and the elemental effects. Though it did make it feel like some enemies weren't quite as much of a threat by that point. There are a couple things that could be viewed as negative things when it comes to combat. For starters, in the open world section of the game that we'll talk about more in just a second, but the combat in open world is much more difficult than you'll be used to from the beginning of the game. I would say in sections of the open world, you have to disable the robots if you're going to try to do some deep level exploration. And the way to do that is there's some robots in the sky that you have to disable in order to cool down the alert levels and keep the regular robots from absolutely swarming you. And that's not the easiest thing to do. You're likely to get swarmed by robots anyways. So if you do not take a strategic plan in the open world, you can find yourself in a real bind. So during open world areas, you need to plan your movements, coordinate some of your exploration around the red dome buildings that house the save points. I found that the open world sections tend to involve a little bit of stealth as you can try to find your way to take down the robots. The problem with this is that stealth isn't great, and trying to stealth kill robots doesn't always work well. It's functional, but not great. Obviously, the game was not intended to be a stealth game, so your options here are pretty limited. So whilst stealth is certainly a factor, it doesn't really help these sort of open world bits as far as combat goes. A lot of the time in the open world, I found myself just avoiding combat in general, getting to each of the Red Dome saved areas and working out as a hub area, if you will. Anyways, combat was fun. I enjoyed it. I can see what they were trying to go for in Atomic Heart. A lot of it I did enjoy. However, sometimes it kind of fell apart at the seams a little bit, which leads to a less than ideal experience, but that was more of the exception rather than the rule. So let's talk about the world of Atomic Heart. Now, technically, I guess you could say this is an open world, but I would use that term very, very loosely. The first few hours of the game are kind of spent in this sort of starter underground area, an almost tutorial-like area, which is pretty long. It's narrative heavy as well, but your first few hours are spent in a more linear dungeon-like experience. And then after that, it steps out into the open world, which is really kind of an explorable area. Even the first explorable area is fairly linear. The game kind of gives you a break and a chance to explore and check out various things should you so choose, which honestly is a lot of fun. You can find some cool stuff out there, though most of the important stuff is centered around the main story objectives, which are facilities littered around the area that the game guides you to. While the world isn't massive by any means, there are areas you're kind of going to have to drive through, which with a car, which will make this your life a lot easier, as you can run over robots and have some fun that way as well. And there is a trophy tied to that as well. The explorable area is sort of fenced in by these laser fences, I guess, that keep you from straying too far off the beaten path, at least in between missions. The missions themselves tend to take place in sort of different facilities that act more like dungeons than anything else. But in spite of this, the explorable world was honestly probably just one of my favorite part of the game, mostly just because it's filled with all sorts of bizarre science fiction-like stuff. To see how scientists were using this polymer substance to do all sorts of crazy and almost arcane things, which is, I think, exemplified by the testing grounds that are spread throughout the open world. You can find these testing ground areas because the game tells you where they are. They are optional areas where you can explore and see some experiments that they were getting up to in the secret facilities and bag yourself some great loot, as well as blueprints for extra weapon upgrades and other useful stuff. This is where a lot of your side content for Atomic Heart takes place, and I would say for me at least it was very, very rewarding. I enjoyed the testing grounds a bunch. There was a lot of puzzle-like challenges in those, which you don't get in the regular open world, the explorable part of it. This again was probably my favorite bit of the game, as well as when I was just running around in the open areas exploring and seeing all this crazy sci-fi kind of stuff that was taking place in this rather unique dystopia that we see on display. Let me make a comment here about the game's save system, which I've only mentioned a tiny bit up to this point. It uses manual save slots, which are only able to be created at save machines. So if you're used to Souls-like games, it's like your bonfire kind of things. The game will autosave every once in a while, which is great with this more linear fashion, but typically in order to save, you have to go up to the machine and just hit a button prompt and that will save the game for you. Now we're not dealing with just a single save file. You can load back up any of your previous 10 manual saves or your autosave. That brings us to our section on getting trophies, especially the Platinum Trophy. The game has several story progression trophies, the obligatory boss fight trophies, and some collectible trophies as well. In addition, there are some style-specific trophies, such as beating a boss using only melee weapons, things like that. It's pretty typical for these kind of games, so you're not going to see anything jump out at you that's out of the ordinary. There is, of course, the difficulty-based trophies, which if you follow my video series, you can overcome easily. The most challenging trophies are the collectible trophies, as you have to pick up all the chirpers, and there's only one extra one, and talking to all of the dead people, which there is only one extra one. And without the New Game Plus mode, there isn't any way to accumulate all the chirpers or dead bodies, so if you miss two or more, you're going to have to restart the game and rerun the entire thing to pick up those collectibles. Your best option to getting all those is just to follow my video guide as I show you where they all are. Obtaining all of the trophies is not tedious, nor do they distract you from playing the game how you would like. There are only 2 weapon-specific trophies, and neither of them takes away from the story or combat. All in all, this is a fairly easy platinum to get. Again, watch my video series on how to get all the trophies in a single run without too much difficulty. And it is possible to cheese the difficulty trophy for beating the game on Armageddon. Just check out my video series. That though brings us to our positives and negatives. Positives for me were the world itself and what they've done here, and the sort of dystopia that they built is very interesting. I enjoyed going around looking and reading and seeing everything that this place had going on, including the little comments from the chirpers, things like that, talking to the dead bodies. Because of this bizarre science fiction effect that they had everywhere and a ton of obvious nods to Fallout and BioShock, at the same time it made for a pretty wonderful world to explore. That, coupled with the combat that I really enjoyed, made for a fun game. I think the only downside to the combat is that you can get overwhelmed in the explorable areas if you do not manage it properly. Otherwise, combat is fast-paced and it's fun. You'll have all sorts of options. You can weave elements and skills together to do all sorts of fun stuff. There are weapons to play around with and you have options with them. I enjoyed the combat quite a bit simply because it was fun, even with some of the minor problems I noted. On the negative side of things, I would say there are very few items. Mostly these are on how you manage the open world, especially on Armageddon difficulty. And while none of it's really game breaking by any means, it's definitely the point at which you remember that this is really more of a AA title than a AAA one. The game does lack a bit of polish here and there, and frankly beyond that though, my other big negative is simply a lack of features. Honestly, there's no field of view slider, there's no regular accessibility stuff. Even the minor things like moving your items from inventory to the vendor storage space, because that's the only place you can disassemble them into parts, all just feels a bit clunky. So while it's not mandatory for the game by any means, I just feel there's a lot of little features they could have added here and there to make this a smoother, although I'm not sure better experience. Like I mentioned, I had a great time with the game. As I noted before, there are some negatives around glitched collectible items. In conclusion, Atomic Heart is a very fun game and easy enough to get the Platinum Trophy for. Some people may have trouble wanting to pay regular AAA prices for this game, which I can understand. For the price though, I think you're getting a very unique world with a lot of sort of bizarre science fiction stuff combined with combat that is very fun to engage with. By and large, I can say that for me, I really enjoyed Atomic Heart. It did a lot of things very well, and I think the core experience they were trying to give you here is shining through. There are a few things I would like to see touched up. Personally, I think most of that is overlooked for the fun that I had doing everything else. So while the game is not quite perfect, I also had a lot of fun exploring and seeing the narrative and the world they built. So for me, this game gets a buy recommendation, especially if you are a Platinum Trophy hunter. By and large, I had a lot of fun with Atomic Heart, and I hope you do too. So this brings us to the end of the video. I certainly hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. All those YouTube beats. Let me know what you think about the title down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Be safe out there and have a remarkable day.